I just want to make sure, we're all coming from lunch. Can everybody raise their right hand and their left hand? Oh, so you're prepared to ask questions. So that's good. All right. So just remember that throughout this whole panel, we're going to be prompting these amazing panelists with some questions, but always feel free to raise your hand and ask a question as it comes to you. We'd like to keep this as interactive as possible and really keep them on their toes, So how many people really feel affected by data privacy and security every day? No one? No one does? No. So yes, this is something that truly affects us day in, day out. So I, for one, am very excited to hear all of your input on these questions. And one way we wanted to start this out is thinking about the basis of all of this, which are the people involved on both ends. And very high level, one thing I wanted to start out asking the panel, and actually we'll start by directing this at Jory, because she's right next to me, so she's the first victim. But first of all, I was just wondering, in all of your views on the human element of this, so the need for more explicit education and training paths for our teams and for people that need to put these things in place.
Yeah, definitely. So, we were talking earlier that, security and digital privacy issues, there's certainly there's technical problems to solve here, but really security those things come down to the people who are responsible for making these technologies and the processes and practices around that. I think in the world I come from is from more of the front end experience. And I don't think there's quite enough ongoing conversation and education for folks in that space to understand the compliance components that affect the business. And we were talking quite a bit about that from the training perspective. And Kyle, you had some.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Does this work? Yes, it does work. Okay, I found the microphone.
We do want to hear from you.
Yeah. No, and it's true. When we talk a lot about automation and security and how important automation is. And I think automation is what takes us to a place where we can be confident that whatever we thought the day that we made the automation is still working. But the really hard part is the people knowing what to put into that automation so that we know that we have some sort of concept of security. And whether we're those front-end developers thinking about how are we going to do this forgot password field, that actually can be quite tricky, and that can open you up to lots and lots of different vulnerabilities if you're not careful. You've got to think not only about the back-end techie stuff about have I scanned my NPM repositories and all, but you've also got to think about the front end. You've got to think about all of it. I think you're absolutely right. ThoughtWorks has been on our journey for a while now. We're a global consultancy, 4,000 people across the globe, and a lot of us software developers, probably more than half. And we see our clients, their CEOs are getting more and more concerned about security, and some of them for very good reasons. Some of them aren't the CEOs of their companies anymore, right? Because of these kinds of things. And so we've taken it upon ourselves just to build our own sort of internal training thing that starts out with, giving you a scenario of, okay, you just came to work and you work for a giant multinational retailer. Sorry, Jason. and we just got a red alarm that there's something going on our web servers, and we've literally planted some known Java vulnerability deep somewhere in the stack. But I think you're right. It's not just that sort of super back-end stuff. It's not just the hard automation bits. It is also that front end. And if we don't think about the user interfaces that we're providing people, and if we don't teach everybody that's doing this stuff, everybody. It's not just the devs. It's the BAs, it's the product managers, it's the QAs, it's everybody. Needs to be thinking about this stuff for it really to work.
And contextualizing those, issues for the context that they're in. Absolutely.
Did you all have any input on that as well?
To me, security has always been a technical thing. I always approach security from the technical point of view. And just today, just after a few minutes of discussion with my fellow panelists, especially Briana and Jory, I got a whole new point of view from a human perspective. And I started to think security, it's not a problem until you have a security breach. It's kind of like insurance. You don't know why you have to buy it, but you realize you need it when you need it. And for us, and a lot of my fellow developers, the security is always something that has the word InfoSec attached to it. It's an InfoSec problem, and within the past few years, as we have transformed WalmartLabs to the front end, at least the web part of our stack, to a Node.js and React.js pure JavaScript stack, we realized that a lot of our developers, they never even consider security. And security to them is always something that the InfoSec forced them to do. And security, however, is an ongoing thing. It's that you can have the most secure system at this moment, and the next second, one of your developers does can compromise your entire company's security, and you will have Equifax on your hands, for example.
I think that's absolutely true. I think in the old world, we would build a system and we would certify it and we'd validate it and we'd say, oh, this one is secure. We're sure about this. And then we wouldn't touch it for the next 5 years, and which is ludicrous because like how many vulnerabilities came out after that?
But,
so,
but you did it once. It's done. You checked it off. Yeah, completed. So one thing that Kyle touched on was kind of the resources and the training that you've done. So I'm curious for everyone out there who has a team to train, where each of you have such a different outlook or kind of approach to security. What are some resources that you would start with to help start training teams?
For us, since we transformed our stack to Node.js, and we realized that our developers are pumping out ever more JavaScript code, and none of those code has been validated for security issues. And the past year, in partnership with our infrastructure group, we've considered putting in place of an active, ongoing process of auditing the code that gets committed. And one of the programs we put in place is a program that we developed internally called Sentinel and a Gatekeeper. And these two tools are CI/CD tools that runs automatically as part of our CI process, a build process. And we use third-party tools like checkmarks, I believe, and dependency checks to scan the JavaScript that gets committed for any standard security violation. And if any code that gets commit has a trigger any alert, then the build fails. So that's the first step we're implementing this year to improve our security. And as an organization at the top level, our chief CIO, Chief Information Officer, has implemented a lot more restrictive process in terms of security, because security most of the time you get hacked because of human factor. So I just received an email last week, for example, that they're implementing a new password restriction. When you change your password, it now has to follow a more restrictive guidelines.
I don't think anybody's received those emails before, right? Yeah.
You click all the links, right?
1, 2, 3, 4 doesn't work anymore. I don't know why.
The OWASP top 10 is an obvious. I mean, I agree. I love your answer. You know, the automation and bringing stuff into your CD pipeline so that you can, guarantee that we're as up to date as we can be. And I think OWASP also publishes their top 10 for vulnerabilities, which is a great source. And frankly, when we started out building our own internal training, we didn't find a ton that was that we could just take off the shelf. We're a little bit stubborn and maybe a little bit too DIY sometimes, so maybe that's why. But a lot of our clients have seen some value in that, and we're talking to them about sharing that as well. But yeah, it's weird how that there's good tooling out there thanks to the teams like yours which are building this stuff. But there's how do we do this? It's not a mystery. That's not right. But there's no
education and training are definitely a top item.
Briana, did you have a?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is that, like you were saying, everything is moving rather quickly in this space with privacy legislation, security, new vulnerabilities. can't speak today. But all those kinds of things. So, staying up to date is really challenging and a really important component to any training program. So, you can't just sort of set it and forget it. You need to make sure that you're updating it, keeping it new.
So I actually wanted to, we can always come back to this if anybody has questions on it, but I wanted to move on to something that I think, almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure everybody on this panel is pretty passionate about, and that's standards and test suites. And the fact that not only are they important, but deemed quite necessary. So actually I wanted to point this at you, Briana, first, kind of how to view this thing as first of like why it's important. So do you know of any instances where the lack of testings has failed in a certain way in the community or a company?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I really wanted to talk about on this panel is that I really believe that getting out in front of standardization is extremely important. And the reason is that for a lot of years, I worked in the polling industry. So, if you ask sort of the average person, how much do you trust political polling? Most people would say, I don't trust it one bit. And part of the reason that happened was the standards on what constitutes a sound poll was not up to date, and people started innovating in the space. People started trying different methods of collecting data. They started reporting polls that were not necessarily have a sound statistical basis. And what happened is you have examples where the polling data doesn't match the actual outcome. And there are many, many examples of that that happened. And so as a result of that, the entire industry was affected in a very negative way. So, imagine how much work it's going to take to bring political polling back to being a trusted source of information about politics. It'll be decades if it ever actually gets back to the point that people trust that information. And so I think that we're kind of at a crossroads now where there's a lot of innovation around data usage methods, AI, machine learning, that kind of thing. And if we don't get out in front of it with standardization, the risk is there that we're going to have the same thing happen in this industry.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to see, because each of you come from pretty different fields, so for each of you, starting with Jory, I would like to know why standardization and test suites are important and how they would affect your process.
So, small essay question. So
You have 20 lines.
Yes,
Yeah.
20 lines. So, to me, standards are important, particularly when you're talking about exchanging information across technologies. Like, if we're just working on, like, say, one project, and we can have a specification that doesn't necessarily need to grow up to be, a big de facto standard or a du jour standard or anything like that. But when we're connecting systems, we need a standard way to recognize that these systems are exchanging information in a consistent, trusted, credible way. And we've come a long way with that in the front end world. We have lots of different organizations working on web standards, and that's really great. We have a lot of implementations of those standards, and now sort of the next piece of that is creating test suites, conformance test suites for each of those, so that we know, in fact, that the protocol is working. And so, I think that is critical for long-term viability of the platform, and that's certainly the perspective that I bring to it. Who's next?
We can go in order. Line up. Yes.
I'll go.
Okay.
Okay. So I already touched up on the process that we are developing, and I think standard and tests is very important as for an ongoing audition of security. And of course, I think standards and rules and tests that's ongoing also gives the people a false sense of being secure. They give people the sense of complacency, and they think that because we follow all these, we're secure. But with standard, we need to have a disruption. We have to constantly challenge our standard. For example, one common misconception I see in our developers is that they think they don't need to worry about security because we have XYZ tests that test this, or we have some XYZ gatekeeper that's keeping certain things out, and so I constantly have to ask them to think about everything you do. You have to make sure that your part is secure, and the standards and the tests, they have to be able to test the system as a whole. They also have to be able to challenge each piece individually to make sure each piece is secure, because the entire system, the strength of an entire system is only as strong as its weakest link.
Agreed. Let's try this and see how it goes. Okay.
I figured you just went and
I
updated
haven't
your
each-
test suite.
That's exactly what happened.
Yes.
Okay, I haven't made a strange sound for the last little bit, so okay, maybe I can talk. Yeah, I think test suites are obviously critically important. And when I think about standards and policies and in the way that different teams need to work differently in order to bring security to the front, like I keep thinking about examples where working with our clients, we've been working with their CISOs, working with their security officers, and sitting down with them and talking about, like, okay, we are going to implement forgot password. I sort of hinted at that earlier. And giving them a chance to say, we have policies around how we will communicate with people. If we will use email, we won't use email, we can use SMS, we can't use SMS. And different sorts of organizations have different policies on this. And I think, context, not control, is a much better way to handle this. So more and more, when we can put that context out with the teams on the ground that are actually doing the work, so that they can know what to test for, I think that's critically important. And often I find that these enterprises that I'm working with, they have lots of policies, and maybe they're good ones, maybe they're medium ones, I don't know, but not always do the developers who are actually working on those systems know that there are policies. And maybe they've got, the big ones, the regulatory, the PCIs and PIIs, they've got HIPAA training every year. But they don't necessarily know that. Anytime we're doing forgot password check, we don't allow email for that. So as soon as you can share that information more with the teams, they have the context that they need to bake that into the test suites, right? And I think the best time to add that to a test suite is at the beginning, like as soon as we know that we're starting to work on something. Tests which have been written like before the code, it's my favorite way, as long as you have that level of discipline, engineering discipline to do that. That's my favorite way to make sure something gets tested. So it's all about sharing that context so that we can bake all this stuff into our test suite instead of finding out later after the fact, so we can be less reactionary.
Yeah, Briana.
Yeah.
So for us, doing the testing and upholding standards in our work is extremely important. Because we're working in the AI space, one of the areas that is extremely important to us is the idea of explainability. And so, we've clocked it, and it takes us, for every hour of actual model development, it takes about 10 times that in order to review the full validation suite and testing for all the things that basically can crop up when you have a system that isn't as direct as some of the other sort of previous types of analytics. And so I see that increasing in importance, the idea of being able to have a set of validation metrics within a company and also across companies, so that you can be sure that what you're getting is valid, and to be able to explain it, to understand exactly how it works.
Thank you. I think back to one of Kyle's points is that security has to be there right from the beginning. It has to bake into the design, and I think that's very important. For example, and as for standard and continuous monitoring and testing, and for things, there's security. There's a certain level of importance to companies, And at Walmart, one of the things for us is PCI compliance, which Kyle also mentioned. And because because we take customer credit card information and we store them, PCI compliance is kind of like you break it, you commit a crime, kind of serious. So so because it's so serious, we have a dedicated team. I mean, even this team, even though they are Walmart employees, but they are kind of like a third-party auditor to us. They are the ones who constantly look at Walmart.com and ensure that we did not break PCI compliance. Because as soon as we break PCI compliance, it will take anywhere from 6 months to 12 months to get back to the level that we can say we are compliant again. Like Briana earlier saying, like once you break that trust, it takes a long time to gain back that trust. So to us, breaking a PCI compliance, we get fined maybe $10,000 or $100,000. That in fact is a small part. The part is how can we what all the trouble we have to go through to gain back the compliance again.
So for people out here who, Disha has a question.
I have a question. In the security realm, I know some key places to go and look to find where do you if you're beginning your privacy security journey, how to go and sort of knock down and figure out what the security considerations are. However, in regards to privacy, that seems a little bit more challenging to find. Where do you begin with building out a strategy around it?
So to be honest, in the privacy space right now, there are a lot of different organizations looking at a lot of different parts of it. It's very piecemeal. And so the challenge is, how do you create a standard, or how do you even learn about standards that exist across industries? So where the most work that I've seen is being done right now is actually in the engineering field. So a lot of the standards that are followed in those companies are sort of starting to touch on some of these privacy areas. So that's where I would personally start. But there are other groups that are starting to form. But as Jory said initially, we're really just starting to have the conversation. And I think that it's missing a key component, which is understanding what the public wants and needs. So a lot of these privacy standards are being pushed forward by industry, but we're not really hearing from consumers or users of the product on what their expectations are with regards to privacy. So I'm hoping those conversations will start to happen, but right now it's mostly being driven by industry.
So that kind of leads. Oh, did you have more, Kyle?
Well, I was just thinking, I think that's true across the board, and I think that's especially true in the States. And having moved to Canada from the States about 20 years ago, I play more the Canadian lens now. And for regulations, I mean, we've got PIPEDA, CASL, and some other things like that, which talk about, what privacy, how you should think about privacy. And HIPAA does a little bit of a job of it, but I agree. I mean, it's not nearly as strong as it needs to be. And I know the Canadian stuff better than like the European GDPR, which is coming out soon. But in absence of a better standard, we're starting to see some regulations come. But I agree, though. I think it's got to be engineering, and I'm really interested to hear what Zuckerberg's going to bring to the table and help us all figure out.
So from what I hear about GDPR, we need a whole conference on that. So we won't touch on that today. But
let me just say something real quick. On that front, on the privacy front, I'm sure we are all familiar with the Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica episode and Zuckerberg's testimony. Regarding Facebook, I think that there's a very good wisdom out there. Like, you should understand that when you use Facebook, you are the product, and you are your own privacy's guardian. That's why before 2010, I've shut down my Facebook account. I have not used Facebook ever since.
So we are going to touch on that later. But before we go on to that, I do want to touch on going back to standards and test suites. And for any of you out there who have to convince somebody of why you need standards and test suites, do any of you on the panel have any resources as far as like things that they can pass on to read, or like different posts or different actual pieces of software to help implement standards or test suites, or just any advice when having to convince somebody why they need standardization or test suites?
Well, on the web, platform side, there's a good deal of blog posts about this. This was actually, a fairly impassioned argument several years ago. Now the conversation that we're having is how the standards are made. We have more or less sort of agreed that web standards are a good thing, and now we're talking about how do we organize ourselves to create the best standards we possibly can. But I wrote a post on, a list apart like 3 years ago about this process, and that cited a number of articles that I relied on in my research. There's a fantastic book by Andrew Schrock called Open Standards in the Digital Age that I highly recommend if you're into that sort of thing. And he really gets into the history of networking standards and how those organizations have, you would like this, Nidya, how those organizations have worked together over the years to standardize telcos and things like that. So those are resources that I'm happy to share and tweet about, and if you want to know.
I sort of quickly mentioned the OWASP top 10 earlier. OWASP. I can't remember what it stands for anymore, but yeah, this is a body that publishes sort of your top 10 exploits, which are always happening. So staying up to date with that gives you some sense of like what threats are out there in the wild. There's other blogs that I follow on security, though I'm blanking right now, which is terrible. You would think I would have prepped. Yeah, but the OWASP top 10 is good, and I think also the kinds of approaches that you were talking about around baking it into the CD pipeline and tooling there.
I just look at my Twitter feed.
So everybody look at Joel's Twitter feed. Yeah.
There's actually a really good article that came out not that long ago about how the law, how litigation is affected by some of these new tools in AI with regards to privacy and that kind of thing. I would say maybe two or 3 months ago. So there's a lot of interest in it from the legal side. So things like, when a self-driving car hits someone, who's liable, right? Or if there's a privacy breach with your, you mentioned HIPAA, your healthcare information, is there a liability issue? And so if you're interested in how that could affect you in a really bad way, I suggest that you check that out.
Related to the sort of new issues that are being raised on the legal front, the Berkman Center at the Harvard Law School also has a number of excellent case studies on sort of this in practice as well.
Nice. So since we have touched on this, does anybody have any questions before we step forward? So we're going to delve into, I think, what are the quite popular topics, and especially since we're talking about digital-first businesses, a lot of times a lot of our companies are dealing with user information. So how much transparency or information do you think is owed to consumers about the way in which their data is to be used? A really easy question.
I think if you would have asked me this question 5 years ago, my answer would have been quite a bit different. So 5 years ago, it was hard to show that usage of private information in, for example, marketing or in the actual functionality of a product was able to cause harm to the user. But now, given the Cambridge Analytica situation, it's a lot easier to say, this isn't just an innocuous thing where, we're going to sell you more shoes, or we're gonna, target your ads better, that kind of thing. Now we can show that it does have real potential negative psychological effects on users of some of these platforms. And so I think that where the action comes from is going to be from the consumer side. So for a long time, businesses were the ones, and even still now, we're driving the standards of privacy. But now, because of the sort of ethical considerations, it's not just affecting, one small group of users of one small thing. It's basically affecting everyone. And so I think what we're going to see are consumer groups being formed to sort of discuss what they believe should be the way that we should standardize some of these things and the way that we should treat privacy. So that was a long answer to say it really depends on how the next, I would say, 6 months to a year goes, in which direction this conversation is going to take.
Interesting. Did you
So,
want to say
so because the question was, was more of an opinion question, right? And so the thing that really came to mind was how we can potentially learn from things like institutional review boards and the academics, where the question of ethically, how are we taking care of our subjects, and how are we using this data, and are we taking care of them psychologically, leaving them in the same or hopefully better place that they were when we found them. We don't really have a great conversation right now around tech ethics. I mean, it's certainly now something we're talking about, but before, companies like, startup companies, digital companies could kind of get away with hand waving, like, oh no, we promise, we won't do anything bad with this. And we're losing that faith and that credibility in the public. So, the question of how do we organize from a tech and create tech ethics, if you will, in the same way that doctors have ethics. And I think will be a conversation worth having. And there's a lot of room for leadership in that.
I'm trying to think about if we have as ThoughtWorks, do we have sort of a corporate stance on this? And the closest thing I can think about to that, our chief scientist, Martin Fowler, wrote a post a couple of years back now, probably 2 or 3 years back, talking about a German word, which I'm going to forget, which kind of covers this concept of being frugal with data. And I think we're all really used to, gorging ourselves on data. Like, now that storage is cheap, collect it all. And, now that, AI and ML can do so much more with it, like, why wouldn't you grab everything you can grab? And we'll figure out what we do with it later. It's cheap, right? Why not? But, there was this sort of thought of, let's be disciplined ahead of time around not doing that, quite specifically, around only grabbing the data that we need right now. If we need to add something else to the data lake later, that's fine, like, we'll do that, but we're not just going to sort of grab everything we can. And we've seen lots of organizations really smother themselves and bring in so much data they don't even know what to do with it. So, I mean, it could even potentially, change results in some other ways. I think personally, it's really interesting. A friend of mine is working for a company right now, which has got, they're using this Jamie Pennebaker algorithm that thinks about how people use pronouns when we're talking to each other. They can look at things like, do we have good rapport? You could look at things like spotting mental health issues ahead of time, and you can see how there could be some massively interesting positives for the HR space and large enterprises, being able to see, oh, this manager's got really great rapport with their employees and so on. And maybe that's helpful, right? That sounds very helpful. But I'd hate to see what the NSA could do with it. I mean, it's a touchy space, and I'd like to see a world where citizens, would have, and of any country, would be able to figure out what information is collected on them by all of their constituent, organizations that they interact with, and be able to revoke that at any time. I don't think we have the capability to do that yet as a species, right? I mean, it would be very expensive to suddenly need to do that. But yeah, that's what I'd like us to be if we could.
I think one place we can start is just, that there's a growing movement of people who feel, we should allow our users to download their data and take their data with them. And I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, it's happening too.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Are there any other instances that you all can think of as far as like transparency to users or an informed user? Like any other instances that you saw that you either hated or loved?
Well, I can draw on some of my personal experiences. Yeah, so, like for example, you know, what I mentioned about Facebook earlier. I mean, I give out my personal information very freely. Actually, I mean, just thinking about whenever I refinance my mortgage, I email everything about me to my loan agent.
You have a repo that just has all
in
your
plain
information.
text. I mean, thinking back, like what was I thinking, but but still, like as a society, you know, we have to give out certain information about ourselves to interact with others, and it's how much of your own information you're willing to give out, and in order to, you know, there are people who got their privacy as the most important thing. And to me, it's that I personally am always vigilant about my, you know, the information that any website collects about me, and generally I try to be careful about that. And one of the things that recently has gotten me kind of like on the edge is how I noticed a while back that Gmail suddenly starts popping up 3 little boxes at the bottom of emails that says sounds good, great. Analyze the email and then offer suggestion on quick replies. And I've used it a few times, but I can't help to think, is Google scanning my email and store it somewhere? So.
What you have to worry about is when those all of a sudden start to say, "I've told you this twice before, Jerry," and you're like, "Wait a second." So does anybody? I have a final question, unless you. Yes, more questions.
So I guess I'm part of the analytics world as the developer, so a lot of what you're talking about really resonates a lot. So my question is, how do you still capture customer data in order to, because you want to provide good customer experience without being too invasive, and still be able to capture those metrics that at the end of the day you need the method business to run?
Did everybody hear that question? Oh, good. Oh, okay. So he was asking, how do you capture the customer metrics that you need without being too invasive? Is that a good TLDR? Okay. Answers, please?
I think that's the big question.
I think it's transparency is very important. For example, like I every time I see any website that wants information from me, I immediately look for at least something that's immediately available on the same page that tells me what are they doing with my data. And typically, I mean, I am okay with my names, the general information I give out. But well, my wife, on the other hand, is a lot more serious about these things. She's like my kids, my kids have their own little YouTube thing that they post videos and they think they have a lot of fans, but unfortunately it's only their parents. But still, my wife is very, very cautious, and she constantly says that I should not allow my kids to post any video onto YouTube. So. And
yeah, my wife hates it when my nephew's on Facebook. It drives her nuts. For sure.
Yeah. But yes, what you're asking is a big question, and I think ethical and possibly government regulation, and I think EU is doing a much better job at that than us.
Just quickly, I mean, like one of my clients in the States is a Fortune 50, giant retailer. Not this one, but one of a similar scale. And they use all these techniques to great advantage, right? They have tons of information. Like anytime you're in one of their grocery stores, you're swiping their loyalty card, and so they kind of know, like what kind of lemons you like, right? And Loblaw does that here. They're not a client of mine, so I can just speak to my personal experience. I go into shop.loblaw.ca and up pops lemons and limes because they know that every time I'm in there I buy lemons and limes. which is great because, like, have you ever tried to search a grocery store for lemon? I mean, you're going to get, I mean, if they're not doing some sort of sorting based on who you are, you're going to get lemon flavored, fizzy water, and you're going to get lemon flavored whatever, and like there's 500 SKUs for milk in grocery alone if you just go searching. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with my client in the States, using that loyalty card data in order to provide a nice sorted experience for people online. I really don't. No one's looking to me for moral advice. That's not why I'm up here. so that's probably good. But I really don't think so. But I don't think that's where we get into trouble. I think it's where we start sharing things further abroad and where there's less and less transparency. I think that's where the rub comes in.
And we're not like minding who we might be sharing that data with or the other sources where that data might be coming from. I mean, it's a nice thing when you go to a website and they say, oh, do you mind sharing this information? Here's how we're going to use it. And I think a lot of consumers would be like, oh yeah, okay, that's fine. If you want my birthday to send me a coupon so I get 20% off, totally, I will do that. But if that then also said, and I'm going to share your birthday and your email address with these 50 vendor partners, and they're going to send you emails and shit on your birthday. That's how you get a bunch of spam in your Gmail account. And that's like personal, right? But so I think it's sort of like on us to, as folks gathering this data, to be really honest about what we're going to do with it, and whom we might be sharing that with. And if that changes, I think we owe it to our users to give them the option to opt out or delete.
I think where the challenge is, so I loved your example about, you always buy lemon and limes at the store, but, you can see a situation where that data is really useful for the store, but much less useful for you as the consumer, because maybe they know that, Kyle has enough money to afford, twice as much for the lemons as, Briana does, right? And so now all of a sudden you have things like price differentiation as a result of the analytics that you're being provided. So you can't really say, oh, we're collecting this to make it good for the consumer all the time, right? Because it's not always.
No, absolutely.
It's a total balancing act, right? Between.
It's incorrect to say it's only for the customer's experience. Yeah. It's also for them to do price optimization. Mm-hmm. Fair point. Yep.
But going back to your initial question, one of the other challenges is when you have things in customer data that changes in relevance. So you might say today, this isn't really important to me. I'm not going to measure it. And then a month from now, you wish you would have because something happens, something explodes, or whatever, and now you don't have that data. So again, that's a balancing act between collecting everything so that just in case something happens forever, versus being really targeted and then potentially missing some things that you needed.
Yes.
I'm curious to know what's your idea of how the concept of privacy has changed, given now that more and more applications collect our data. Do you think we're less and less protective of our data, our personal lives? Like, what is considered private anymore?
So Sarah's asking what they think has changed in privacy now that more users are.
How do you feel like our concept of privacy has changed?
Oh, so the concept of privacy now that more and more users are aware of what's happening?
Or how now applications collect.
We have more
how
data.
applications
Are we
collect.
now just complacent about, it's okay if they know my SIN number?
Yeah.
That's exaggeration, but it's just seems
Well,
more and more.
I want that mortgage too. Yeah, no, I mean 2.69 is a great rate, right? No, I'm with you. I mean, and the interest rates are going up, and yeah. So I'm with you. And it's funny, from my own personal journey, I remember thinking that it's okay. If the U.S. government or any government wants all of my data, I trust them, and they're only trying to do right by the world and security and all of this and safety. And I still largely think that is true. That viewpoint has not changed. Like my politics, about the current president aside, I still basically believe in humanity and believe that human beings are trying to do well for one another. But I do think that, and the more data that is out there, the easier it is for bad actors to manipulate that and use it. And I'm not the political modeler up here, so I won't comment on how that could be to someone's advantage. But yeah, I think I've personally shifted from the thinking, that's fine, they can have whatever they want on me, I really don't care, to, okay, that may be true for me, but I don't want that judgment to go for everybody else. If there are others who do want privacy, I'm going to support that for them. Because I do think, you get to a point where journalists don't want to write stories if someone's got blackmail on them, right? And that means that we're not a good informed public anymore. And maybe I'm reaching a bit there, but I do think we have to be careful with it, and I think it matters. That to be said, at the same time, though, I think we are definitely all watching a generation grow up with all of their data captured, all of it. Pictures of my nephew, since he was born, on Facebook. Yeah, and that's just the pictures, right? I mean, everything else. So it's interesting to watch us change. But my own personal belief is still that we've got to be careful about this. And if someone wants to exercise that right, I think it's important.
I feel like our public attitudes towards privacy have certainly changed, right? In terms of like what we would have been comfortable, 20 years ago, I would not have felt comfortable trying to purchase something online, or 15 years ago, it just wouldn't have happened because, oh no, that's my credit card. And but I was on AOL, and I would be very happy to post like pictures of myself and that kind of thing. And for me, there's been a bit of a yo-yo now where I've like gone back to being like more private. I have a sticker over my camera and a two-factor auth on everything and that kind of thing. But I'm kind of wondering whether it's our society's attitudes toward privacy that are sort of changing and shifting the technology, or if it's like the technology and our kind of business need to collect data that's changing our societal attitudes toward it. I don't know, but like I feel like there's a conversation that needs to be had there.
Just a heads up, we have about 2 minutes. So did either of you want to input on that?
Sure, just something quick. I think privacy is a very, very old thing, like back to thousands of years. There's always the nosy neighbor thing, right? And as far as the internet age goes, privacy, the use of your private information and what people do with it, what companies do with it, change. But my bank has always know everything about me more than I do. and in fact, there are websites on the internet where you like go and just type in someone's name and learn almost everything you can about them. And so your private information has always been out there with someone. It's just that how they use it, how ethical they are about it has changed. And today, and as awareness increase and because of all these big incidents that occur, people become more aware that what people out there can do with their private information. And I think that is an important change of paradigm.
I think for me, what's new within the last, say, 3 months or so, is for a long time we were talking about privacy in, what do I tell a company or whatever about myself? But now the conversation is, what do other people tell companies about me? So now we no longer have control over how much we share, because other people close to us can share that information too, despite the fact that we may not want to, for example, tell them, who are our closest friends, on Facebook, and who am I spending the most time with. You don't have to share that information. You can have that completely private, but it's your friend or acquaintance that actually has some control over the data that you share. So that's such a new conversation that I'm not really sure where that's going to go. But if you think about it, you kind of like expand that out 5 years from now. If anyone can share information about anyone else, then it's hard to imagine a world where we won't have more significant privacy standards in place throughout all industries.
Sarah just looks scared now.
Sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. So to wrap this up, one, I want to thank the panelists very much for everything that you've, all the information you've given us today. So we have a round of applause for them. And then for the audience members, just to wrap this up, I'd like to go down the line, and if you could just say a few words of, if anybody out there wants to come to talk to you, what your most passionate security, privacy topic is, just in a few words down the line.
I'll start with, I would love to talk about ethics and standards, if that's something that you're interested in. I'm Jory.com on Twitter, or I'm here all day.
Perfect.
I think applications of things like threat modeling and other processes, and how to sort of bring context around like what security ought to be forward, so that developers and people who are building digital experiences can be thinking about that all of the time.
That was like 40 words. Just kidding. Good job.
I think open and standards are what's most important about bringing everyone together and build communities.
Perfect.
For me, it's definitely public trust, especially around AI and machine learning.
Awesome. Thank you all very much.